So Taylor, do your favorite preacher's manuscript?
I would say yes and no. My favorite preacher of all time is actually a preacher nobody's heard of, and that's my dad. And he passed away in 2011, but he wasn't a vocational pastor. He wasn't a vocational preacher. He was actually just a really, really good Sunday school teacher. And so when you look at my notes and you look at my style of teaching, the person I learned that for more than anything else was my own father. And I love all kinds of different preaching, but ultimately the most important influence of my preaching has been the man who led me to faith in Jesus Christ and showed me how to be just a very faithful follower of Christ and to use and exercise the gift that God had given me to the best of my ability for His glory.
Dude, what a legacy. That's really cool. I'm sorry for your loss of him. But also, man, how cool that you can say my dad is the guy that shapes me the most. That's really
I don't
awesome.
know many people that get to say that, and that's a gift I think I'm always going to hold on to.
Well, hey, welcome to the Preaching Through podcast. My name is Luke Simmons. I'm normally with Dave Shine, but Dave is not with me today because I have the privilege of interviewing Taylor Burgess, who I'll introduce you to here in just a minute. But if this is your first time with us, the Preaching Through podcast is all about trying to be one voice of encouragement, trying to help you preach faithfully in the 21st century. And today's episode in particular has come out of a lot of interaction that I have in the preaching lab. So if you've listened to this for a while, you've heard some sort of ad for the preaching lab or a pitch on kind of what we do. And I've done multiple rounds now of it in helping preachers just get a little bit better. What we talk about is that, we're trying to get 1% better now in a way that compounds over time. But a bunch of the guys that go through it manuscript their sermons. They write it out word for word. And that is something I've done in the past, but it's not something I do now. And we can talk about why I don't and that sort of thing. But there's a lot of guys that do. And my concern is not whether people manuscript. I don't really have a dog in that fight. My concern is that people do it well if they're going to do it, and they do it strategically. But I wanted to talk to someone who, from the best I can tell, does it well. And that's Taylor Burgess. And so Taylor is the founding and lead pastor of Cross Community Church in Beaufort, South Carolina. He planted it in 2016. He's a father to 3 boys. And you already heard his heart for what it is to be a dad. And I love just as he and I have interacted on Twitter, just to be able to see his heart for his family and his intentionality with his family and with his ministry. They've got a growing ministry. They got about 1,300 people on a Sunday, 4 services, which is crazy. Maybe we'll talk about that as well. Everyone that's hearing that is going, oh, that sounds so cool, and ouch. But he's about to finish up a D-Min in expository preaching, so he's going to be an expert in expository preaching any day here. And they just had a really great year. In addition to growing numerically, they grew significantly through people experiencing conversion. Had 99 folks baptized last year, which is really, really cool. And I know anyone listening, that's what we want. And so, I talk about that I want my ministry to be faithful and fruitful. I want it to be faithful to what God says and faithful to what God wants. I also want to see God grow it and develop it. And so as I've interacted with Taylor, I've just thought, man, he would be a great guy to have a conversation with because I think he embodies a lot of that. So with that long wind up and introduction, Taylor, thank you for joining us on the Preaching Through podcast.
Man, it's really good to be here, and it's again good to see you in a moving context, not just as a Twitter avatar. I feel like this is the culmination of like 100 different Twitter interactions that we've already. It's X now, excuse me, X. I don't want to get in trouble for that. But yeah, it's good to see some of this come to fruition.
Well, and I forget, Taylor, how we started interacting specifically about manuscripting. I'm not sure how, and I don't know if you recall, but at some point you brought up that you do, and you shared some of the reasons why. And so that made me, or maybe it was a post of your own that you did. I don't recall. But at some point you got on my radar as, oh, here's a guy who's a good preacher who manuscripts and tries to do it intentionally. Do you remember how that came up?
I do. And the only reason I remember is because when I was pulling some notes together for this, I went back to that interaction, and you had posted something, I think from Joe Thorne, about manuscripting sermons, and had made a comment a question or something about, hey, if you manuscript, how does that work for you, and word count or something like that. And yeah, we had some interactions within that context.
Yeah. So you said, as we interacted a little bit about this, and this is where I want to begin the conversation, is that you don't always manuscript. So it sounds like most of the time you do, but sometimes you don't. What does that look like for you?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a moving target. It is something that I like to do. It is primarily what I do. But there's a number of different factors that can go into it. Some of them are really just kind of, hey, what I'm feeling for a particular message. Some of it is context specific. Where am I speaking? Who am I going to be speaking to? So generally for just the week in, week out shepherding of our congregation, I manuscript sermons, and we can get into to a lot of the reasons why that is. But context where
So
I
the
don't,
default setting for you, then the default setting is that you're going to manuscript. There
generally
might be some
speaking, yeah,
times when you don't, but typically you're.
generally speaking, even if I don't preach from a manuscript, I really enjoy the process of just writing myself clear, making sure I know exactly what I'm going to say, where things are going. Has this been well developed? So even if I don't preach from it, the process of developing it is a key point of my preaching prep every single week.
Now you mentioned there, and you've told me before, that part of why you manuscript is because of context specific reasons, which is pretty interesting. I would tend to think you either do it because that's the habit of how you like to do it, or you don't because you don't. How would the context affect a decision about whether to manuscript your sermons?
There's few factors for us. One, you and I were just talking about before we got started here is we do 4 worship services in a weekend. 3 of those are in the morning. One of them is in the evening. And especially when we got to a place as a church where we were doing 3 worship services, I really wanted to make sure the message I was delivering was very, very consistent from service to service. And I saw especially a potential challenge coming with that 6 p.m. Sunday service, because it's preach a few times in the morning, you eat lunch, go home. For me, I always tell our congregation after Sunday afternoon, that's when I go home and watch the Panthers lose. And then, I'm going to go back and do it again. And I saw potential for there being too much variation from service to service. And so what I have found within our context is, I think, just the season that we're in right now, it's really important to me that as our church is growing, that regardless of what service you attend, you're going to hear the same message that I preached in the other services. And it's not that when I've done that before that it's been a different message, but every once in a while, there'd be a situation where I might randomly, if I wasn't preaching from manuscript, I might drop in an extra illustration, or I might expound on something a little bit differently. And part of our context too is that our community groups are sermon-based discussion. And there were a couple points where, you'd hear from community group leaders where they'd have someone in a group where it's like, well, in the first service, this was said, but it wasn't said in the third service. But then we recorded the second service, so nobody was able, to to go back and
Yeah.
figure out. And never like a major situation, but just some moments where it just became clear to me. I just say, even for me, I was like, I need to do something that brings a little bit more continuity, from service to service. And so that's just something I have found that just helpful guardrails for me that make sure I'm staying in the same lane with each group, and that our congregation really is hearing the same message, regardless of what service that they might attend. And so context specific for number of services, context specific for sermon-based discussion. It's a helpful tool. I mean, oftentimes I'll have community group leaders just either some weeks I'll just go ahead and put it out there in advance. They might ask for my notes. I love to study the Bible in community, and while my sermon prep primarily is solo, I crave feedback. I love to send notes to our elders in advance, and don't do this all the time, but a lot of times, especially if it's going to be a message where we might get into some more sensitive waters, I want them to be able to see that. We went through the book of Ruth back in the fall, and there was one particular sermon I remember. There were some specific things I really wanted to be able to say to women in our congregation. And so having a manuscript was a really helpful thing that I actually I sent it out to the women on our staff. And we just took about an hour one day, and I just listened to what they had to say. And I wanted to know, in advance of preaching it for our whole congregation, just, how certain things were landing on them, how they were hearing them, and where it could be clarified. And it was just a really helpful process. And so I think it really invites in a lot of positive ways. Really helps us build a little bit more of an Acts 17 Berean community, where the church really does feel like, hey, we have a responsibility ourselves when it comes to the preaching of the word. Our elders see the responsibility of making sure that I or whoever's preaching that week is like, man, we've looked at this together. We agree that this is a faithful word that would be good for our congregation. And again, just gives the congregation, gives our community group leaders, it gives others just a helpful resource themselves that it can, whether they can use it to supplement their own Bible study or whatever it is. It just tends to be a helpful tool in our context that really encourages a community-wide preaching of the word. Where yes, primarily it's my responsibility to prepare, it's my responsibility to preach, but people actually feel like they're participating in that and not just listening as spectators.
Man, there's so much wisdom just in what you shared there at a number of different things. I mean, I can especially think about how having that many services, that was one of the guesses I had, was like, I bet one of the values of that is, I preached 5 times on Christmas Eve. By that 4th or 5th service, I preach normally 3 times on a Sunday, but that 4th or 5th service, I'm going, did I already say that?
Oh yeah,
like your mind becomes a little bit of mush. And I would think one of the advantages is that consistency. The other thing that would be helpful is, sometimes when people are in that 3-4 services range, they'll use the first one as a little bit of a warm-up act, which I think is dangerous, right? Like, I don't want to practice on people. I want the people that come at the first service to have a great experience. And so I just think that makes a lot of sense. I also think that whether someone manuscripts or not, the wisdom of saying, hey, I'm about to get into something tricky, and I'm going to maybe not manuscript a whole sermon, but I'm going to at least try to write out word for word, best as I can tell, how I will say this part, and get wisdom from elders, get wisdom from some of those women, get wisdom from some of those people. Like, I don't think you have to manuscript to do that. But I think there's just a ton of wisdom there. So I really appreciate that. I have a follow-up, I guess, on the consistency. Sometimes, no matter how well you plan it, and no matter how well you write it, and how clear you think yourself as you do the manuscript, you get in the moment and you think of something. And a fresh illustration comes to mind, or a fresh cross-reference, or a fresh way to say it. I'm assuming that still happens for you. And I'm curious, when that does happen, do you then kind of add it into the notes so that you make sure you keep doing it the rest of the time? Or do you try to restrain yourself from that? How do you approach those kinds of moments? Hey, you sick of hearing about the Preaching Lab yet? My guess is those of you who've listened for a while have heard some ads about the Preaching Lab, and you've kind of gone, oh, that sounds kind of interesting. But you may wonder, what is it really like? And what I think it's like is a group of guys who are really hungry to try to improve, who come together for a couple of months and share ideas, share resources, share illustrations, and just root for each other. A lot of times we need someone in our corner, and we need some people who believe in us and who know what they're talking about to help us just get a little bit better. So that's what we do, is every couple of weeks we get on a call. Having watched the videos that are part of the Preaching Lab, we process it, we talk about it, we ask questions, we try to sharpen each other in our preaching. And then I give feedback to a couple of guys on their preaching on a recent sermon. Then I don't let them send me their sugar stick best of sermon. We just look at something they looked at recently. And I try to point out some stuff, some small differences they could make that would actually make a big difference in the long run. And it sounds scary. Everyone's a little bit intimidated to go through it, but man, at the end of it, everybody's like, gosh, this was so helpful. So that's what the Preaching Lab is about. We have the on-demand version, which you can go through anytime. And then throughout the year, we do these live cohorts. And if you're on the fence or have been kind of hearing about it a little bit, I just want to give you a little nudge. It'll be worth it. You'll get better. And even more than that, you'll develop some cool connections and relationships with some other guys who are hungry like you. So that's what the Preaching Lab is all about. Go to faithfulandfruitful.com to learn more.
Yeah, for sure. I think that is one of the dangers of manuscripting, is that if we're not careful, we can find ourselves suppressing, in a sense, the work of the Holy Spirit. And I always joke with our guys, in our staff and our culture, leadership culture, that all my sermons are always 80% prepared. That I've manuscripted, but there's still I just know my own natural personality and tendency. There's still gonna be a 20% that's just gonna come. And man, it's just gonna be prompted by my devotional life. It's gonna be prompted by my prayer life. It's if I get up to pray before the sermon, and I see someone who they just lost a loved one that week. I mean, and there's something in the message that I know that would speak to that. In that service, I'm probably gonna camp out on that a little bit more. And so there are absolutely still varying degrees from service to service. And I never want to just mechanically, robotically get up and just say the exact same thing and say, well, sorry, I can't go off script. I can't
Yeah.
deviate from this. And I do think that's one of the dangers that anyone who preaches from a manuscript has to be sensitive to. And so, generally, what I'll do is, so let's say I say something in our second service that I didn't say in our first service. I want to be cognizant of that. And so typically what I'll do is in between services, I'll take a minute and I'll just make a quick note, in my notes somewhere in the margins. And then I'll try to say that same thing in the other two services. And then at a minimum, what we'll do is I'll make sure whatever recorded service we do, it's the service that includes that, so that if there was someone, first service who didn't hear this and somebody was to mention it, they could go back and hear that. And again, a lot of that just comes from situations like what I mentioned just a moment ago was that there are times where there was a little too much inconsistency. I know my own personality too much, and I very, very much want to be sensitive to the leading of the Holy Spirit and to the promptings of the Holy Spirit. And
sometimes what happens is you don't just add to it because a fresh insight comes, but you go, oh, you know what? This was too long.
for sure. Yeah,
I spent too much time on
absolutely.
that first point, and it made it where when I got to the climax of the message at the end, I had to rush. And so there's always some editing down that probably still happens, I would think.
Totally. Yeah. There was even a couple weeks ago, I had a message where there was, and I had a feeling this might be the case even before I preached it. There was, something that I was trying to explain that required a little bit more explanation, but it's just, when you get into explaining the text, it was an important explanation that we needed for clarity on what the text was saying. But you could started to see that the glazed over looks a little bit. I need some kind of just little word picture, that I could drop in halfway through all that, just so it's not 5 or 6 minutes of me just explaining. Like, so not a full-blown story, not a full-blown illustration, but I could already tell after a first service, I was like, I need to do something there that just helps that stick a little bit more. And so, yeah, just I don't remember what it was at this point in time. It's dropped in a little word picture, and you could immediately tell, difference in that second service, and stuck with that, for the others. And I want to be very well prepared. I want to be very, very familiar with the manuscript. And what I have found is that your familiarity with the manuscript actually gives you a lot more freedom in your preaching. So like if I've really internalized that message well, and it's getting to the place where it is going to be free flowing, I actually find more freedom in those moments of just knowing like, hey, we're going to get back on track in just a moment. I know where this is going. I feel at times gives me that freedom to deviate a little bit more in the more, because I know how I'm going to get it back on track and where it's going to go. And so, again, I think a lot of that just, again, familiarity and confidence within that, but don't be so rigid that it's just, hey, this is what I've prepared. This is what I'm going to say. This is what I'm going to read. As I'm interacting with people on Sunday morning, I know not everybody's wired this way. I like to be around people before the services and after the services. In a lot of ways, I mean, I'll make adjustments just even based on conversations that I'm having, because I think this is part of pastoring and shepherding. It's like, hey, what is the tone coming into the building today? I mean, are people really, really excited to be here, or is it the first Sunday of the year kind of January blues where we live on the coast, but it's cold outside and there's a lot of dreary faces? And and just the post-Christmas blues. And so I think just being sensitive to those factors can and should, I think, shape a lot of what we're preaching, just so we're shepherding our people well, and being sensitive to what's happening in the room around us, and not just being locked into whatever word it is that we've prepared.
I want to go back to something you said a minute ago about internalizing, because I actually think that's really something every preacher, whether you write with a manuscript or have limited notes, needs to do. And the place I realized that was actually at one point, for a long time when I was learning to preach, the folks that taught me said, you have to manuscript. And it wasn't as like a theological conviction. It was just in training. They were trying to help you think clearly. And so I appreciated that as a way to begin. And at some point I went, I would like to just try to preach once with no notes. And what I found through doing that is the only way you can do that. You can't try to memorize it. That's too hard. And you certainly couldn't try to memorize it every week. You have to internalize it. And so I totally agree with what you said about, whatever it takes to internalize it. And if that means writing it all out, great. If that's more bullet points, fine. But I think that the only time you have freedom as a preacher is when it's actually in you. And the way I think about whether I've internalized it is like, could I sit across a coffee shop table with someone and go, here's the thing, like, here's what I'm talking about, and if I can't get that, now that may not be exactly how I'd say it, right? That's one of the advantages probably of manuscripting, is you can be a little more specific with some wording, but you could just at least get the main thing across if you've internalized it. If you haven't, then it's a little bit like, it's like the preacher. I always joke about the guy who says, now here's something I want you to never forget. And then he looks down at his notes and has to read it. And it's like, well, wait a minute. Like that feels incongruent. So I appreciate that. That's what your heart is to go, how do I internalize this so that I can respond to the promptings of the Spirit, so that I can read the room. And one of the things you do really well is, I've watched videos of you preaching, is you don't seem tied to your notes. You don't seem, especially when you're telling personal stories, you just tell the story. I think it's sometimes guys who manuscript, like, they're reading me a personal story from their life. And it's like, why do you do that? Like, you lived it. You don't have to read it. Like, just tell me the story. And so you do a very good job of, I think, looking body language wise free as you communicate. So it's clear to me that you do internalize it.
I think with manuscripting, the hook I try to give guys sometimes, because that is absolute, that's the danger, right? It's getting up and you're just reading it. And an illustration I've given before, I think the movie's like 20 years old now, which is crazy to think about, but I don't even know if this is a real event or not. Joaquin Phoenix in his Walk the Line movie, where he plays Johnny Cash. And he goes into like his first studio recording, and he starts playing, some old gospel song from the radio. And the producer who's listening, they get like a verse into the song, and he cuts him off. And he's basically like, hey, I don't mean to offend you or whatever. He's like, but do you guys have anything else? So they started asking why, he wanted to sing another song. And his reasoning behind it all, he said, is I don't believe you. Like, it's CG. He's like, I just hear you singing, this same song that a bunch of other people have just ripped off. And that's, in the movie, and again, no clue if this happened in real life or not. I'm sure there's a Johnny Cash historian who knows. In the movie, he then sings, I think it's Folsom Prison Blues, and it's, and then of course it just takes off after that. And so, that's what I want to say sometimes when I hear guys preaching from a manuscript, is it's like, hey man, it's not that your content isn't good. It's not that you're not well prepared. It's not that you're not thoughtful. It's not that you're not articulate. It's that I just flat out don't believe you. And that's where I think with manuscripting, you just got to really ask yourself, like, do I have a sermon, or does this sermon have me? Have I been gripped by the truths of God's word? Am I, John Wesley, like a man on fire? Like, am I burning in my soul the words that are on this page? And that's where I think you just have to be so careful. I've heard some really, really good, well manuscripted sermons that just, didn't move anyone. And it's not to limit, the effectiveness of the word of God. Like, scripture is doing what it's doing, but you just have seen places where a message just did not quite land the way it could have And I think a lot of it has to do is like, I'm not sure that message had moved the guy preaching. He prepared a sermon, but he wasn't prepared to preach in terms of really just having immersed himself in these truths, having internalized these truths themselves, fire burning in his bones in such a way that, man, there's no doubt, like when people listen to you preach, I think that's a lot of it is you just want them to be able to say, like, hey, even if I disagree with you, like I believe that you believe the things that you're preaching right now. And yeah, so I think when you're thinking of preaching from a manuscript, another example I've given guys is it's almost think of like a driver who's on a scenic drive through the mountains. My family and we were at Glacier National Park this summer, and it's just incredible. I mean, I think it's probably the most beautiful place I've ever been in my life. And I was an absolute hazard to everybody else that was on the road because, I mean, you've got these ridiculous views, just off the edge of the cliff. So yeah, I'm driving and I've got to be able to keep my eyes on the road, but you better believe I was taking in the mountains is well. And so I would say to guys preaching from a manuscript, think of yourself as taking a scenic drive through the mountains. You primarily got to keep your eyes on the road. I mean, because you don't want to be a hazard to the people around you. So think of looking at your notes as just kind of taking that quick glance at the mountains and just going, okay, wow. And then looking up and then, wow. Okay. And then looking up and just making sure that you're not just sitting there tied in reading the whole time. That's where I think a lot of the disconnect going to be. And a lot of that, again, it's internalizing, it's manuscript familiarity. It's not just waking up and winging it on Sunday morning. It's being sure that you're confident in what you have and what you're about to say, and that you're really, really familiar with what you're about to say in a way that people really, really, truly believe that you believe what you're saying.
Was that classic Ezra 7:10 verse, right? That he devoted himself to study and then practice and then teach. Right? A lot of us just want to go study, teach, study, teach, study,
Yes.
teach, and it is that internalizing that's a big part of it. So, I don't have a big dog in this fight. Like, it doesn't really matter to me whether people manuscript or don't. I want people to be effective. I want them to be faithful to the scriptures. I want what comes out of the sermon to be what's coming out of the text. But I also want it to be interesting. I want it to be engaging. I want it to have gear changes and be easy to follow and be emotionally stirring in the right ways, right? Like that's what matters to me. It doesn't matter to me whether you manuscript or don't. So I'm not trying to convince anyone to do it or to not do it. It's mostly like what helps you move the ball forward. And I've encountered some guys, especially through the preaching lab, who I thought, I'm not sure manuscripting is helping you. And other guys who maybe it's like, maybe a manuscript would help you. So I'm curious from your perspective, Taylor, who should consider starting to manuscript and who should consider stopping manuscript?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think anyone who would consider starting to manuscript. One could be anyone who really is a good writer. I mean, if you're a good writer, and you've never manuscripted a sermon before, I would really, really urge you to give that at least one attempt. If you're a good writer, writing comes naturally to you. I would encourage you to do that. Or even if I think manuscripting can be a great way to grow in your ability as a writer. Again, you mentioned earlier, I'm doing D-Min studies right now, and as I've worked through my D-Min the last few years, I can't even begin to tell you how much the practice of manuscripting sermons week in and week out has made that process so much easier for me. And it helps me week in and week out grow in my ability as a writer. So anyone who is a good writer, wants to grow in your ability as a writer, I would say anyone. This is an important caveat too. It's anyone who's capable of writing in your preaching voice, because I think that is, again, one of the disconnects. It's Philip Brooks, preaching. It's truth through personality. And so again, if you're capable preaching in your writing voice, I think there's a good opportunity there. If you're a good writer and you can preach in the same way that you write, that's good. Anyone that is regularly told that what you're preaching isn't clear or well developed, I do think that is a warning sign. Again, and I want to be with clarity. I know that clarity can be kind of a toss up. Someone asked the question, do you feel like that could have been more clear? I think the answer is always yes. The reality is we've got 40, 45 minutes on a Sunday morning. You can't say everything about everything every single week as much as you wish you could. But if you're regularly being told like, hey, I just don't know where you were going with that. I struggle to see how that illustration connected to that passage. I'm struggling to see how you got that application from that text. I'm struggling to see how you developed that main point from the passage that we were in that week. There's going to be criticism with preaching no matter what. But if it's people that, man, they love your church and they love you, and you know that they're invested and they want the best for you, if they're regularly saying those types of things to you, you probably need to do some work there. And even if you're not going to full manuscript the sermon, I think even starting with the practice of like, hey, do it with your introduction, do it with your conclusion, and do it with your transitions, because we know in preaching, like transitions, you mentioned gear shifts a second ago, that's where it can get a little bit rocky. It's when you're moving from point one to point two to point three. How are we shifting gears, from one thing to the next, from explanation to illustration to application? And manuscripting is a helpful piece of that puzzle, because you really can see the whole map then and say, okay, I've got a lot of explanation here. Maybe need to illustrate that a little bit better. I do application both ways. Sometimes it's through the message, sometimes it's at the very end. But it's just a helpful process just to see like, hey, am I illustrating this well? Am I applying this well? Have I explained this thoroughly enough? So again, if you're regularly being told that you lack clarity, it's not well developed, it's hard to follow, you go on a lot of rabbit trails. Like if you just don't have the discipline of staying on course, then it's probably worth trying. And then I would say, and this is a personal testimony here, anyone who's maybe preaching a little bit too long. I've got a very gracious congregation, incredible staff. And again, 4 services, we were going through the book of Judges, and so getting in some really, really weighty things week in, week out. I wanted to make sure I was explaining things well, and wasn't manuscripting messages at the time for that particular series. And I was just preaching too long some weeks. I mean, and again, no complaints about the content, not complaints about, just the my preaching ability or anything like that. But the reality is, like, it was messing up service transitions. The parking lot's getting backed up and kids ministry's getting backed up. And what's helpful for me manuscripting is I know, the way I do mine, it's landscape notes, side by side, 2-column. And I know that 1 column for me is 5 to 6 minutes. And so, yesterday I had 7.5 pages and I preached right out about 43 minutes. And so you do the math on that, it's pretty predictable. So it's helpful, to, if you're really, really struggling to stay within the time frame that you need to, it's just it's a helpful exercise there.
So then on the flip side, and is who should consider stopping manuscripting or manuscripting less, right? Like you mentioned, like maybe you do your intro, your conclusion, and your transitions, or here's a key tricky part that you want to make sure you word in a precise way. But who right now is like, they manuscript the whole thing, they feel a burden to do it all the time, but you actually would go, you know what, man, you maybe should back it off a little bit.
Yeah.
Is there anybody?
Yeah. I mean, I think if you're not a good writer, you probably shouldn't. And I know some guys, again, they're great communicators, but just not good writers. And I would tell them, like, hey, don't manuscript your message. It's going to mess you up. Like, so if you're not a good writer, I would say don't do it. Anyone who can't write the way that they normally speak. I think I mentioned the Philip Brooks quote earlier, truth through personality. And we see this through scripture, right? I mean, the Lord works through unique personalities. Peter and Paul, very different personalities. Peter, even saying things like, hey, some of Paul's stuff hard to understand, and I think we can all amen Peter on that, just very, very different types of personalities. You can't write in your preaching voice. It is a little bit of an acquired skill. I mean, you've got to learn if you're going to do this, you've got to learn how to write the way that you talk. And that's a challenge, because sometimes we write very, very differently than we talk. And writing can tend to be a little bit more academic, where our normal everyday conversation isn't. So, at the end of the day, I want to be articulate. I want to be nuanced. And a lot of that comes through those read-throughs. and it's manuscript familiarity before you get up and preach it. When I'm walking through a manuscript, the editing I'm doing along the way is I'm just asking, like, hey, do I actually talk like that? Like, does this sound like something that I would say in a conversation with that tone of voice, with those facial, how would I say that if I was actually just having a conversation with you? I don't want people to see someone different in the pulpits. I don't want there to be a disconnect between my public ministry and the way you and I might have a dinner table conversation. Again, so I think you got to be really honest with yourself about that. And I think a lot of that involves inviting really good feedback from people that you trust. I mean, people who love you, that you love, that will just be brutally honest with you and be like, hey man, you don't talk like that. And then I think another group that I would encourage to stop is anyone who's just getting up and reading it. If that's all it is for you, I mean, you write some books, go for it.
Sure.
Send your church a good blog post, every single week. Man, is there fire in your bones? Have you internalized this message? That it's evident that you're not just hoping this message is impacting others. It's impacted you. I mean, it's moved you, because there does come a point, I think, if you're just reading, there does come a point where I think you have to ask the question, is preaching really your calling? I mean, is that really what the Lord has called you to do for the building up of the body? I mean, because that when you see words like, whether it's prophecy or exhortation, the one who leads, Romans 12, with zeal, that needs to influence your preaching as well. It's not just a content thing. There are biblical characteristics for how our preaching should be shaped and how it should be coming across. And so again, just getting up and reading, I'm not quite sure that, again, if there's somebody that's doing that somewhere, and man, people are loving it, the church is being strengthened and edified, and that the Great Commission's being fulfilled, hey, praise God, go for it. But I would submit that that's probably not the best practice or approach.
Yeah, the other people that I would say should maybe consider stopping, I'd think of a few more categories. One would be someone that just is like, I hate sermon prepping because of this.
Yeah.
Like, okay, well, stop. Like, I had a friend a few years ago. He went from being like a young adult pastor to being the senior pastor. And he's like, I hate sermon prepping. It's agonizing. I'm like, dude, you're going to be doing this for the next 30 years, God willing. Come up with a system you like.
Absolutely.
So I'd say that would be one. Similar to that would be if there's someone who's just going to really agonize over word choice in a way that you would not do as you were talking, kind of along the same lines, but like, and then if you're going to say it a little bit differently than exactly how you wrote it, that's going to really bother you. Like, I just think some of that would be either figure out how to write it more in your own talking voice, or maybe just feel like I can just put a bullet point and that'll get me kind of launched into what I know I want to say. And then the other person that I talk to, and this is what I run into a lot in the preaching lab. So I want to move into some of the mechanics here in terms of timing and how you do all this. Is there are some folks that I think you're just spending too long on your sermon prep. And this is one of the main reasons I don't do it. I typical sermon preparation for me will be 6, 7, 8 hours, sometimes more, very rarely less. I think if I were to manuscript it, that would bump me up to 11 or 12. And I don't think the sermon would be 50% better. And like you, I'm leading a big church, a lot of complexity, a lot of different things going on. Even if you're not leading a big church, ministry is just complicated.
Yep.
And so some guys who I think they're just taking, like, it's eaten up their whole week. They're not able to lead. They're not able to shepherd. They're not able to move any other projects forward. Those would be some people I go, hey, you might want to consider finding a more efficient approach. I don't think it should all be, let's just get up there and be as quick as we can. But that would be, so I'm curious for you, like, how everyone has different ranges. How long is too long for a sermon? And kind of getting nitty gritty, because how do you get more efficient and be efficient enough? Like, you go, okay, I need my 7 pages. That's going to be about 35, 40 minutes. how do you get efficient with that time? And at what point would you go, you know what, it's taking too long. I need to do something else.
I always hesitate sometimes asking how long someone should spend on prep, because I kind of feel like that's asking, how long is a piece of string? There's a lot of factors that go into that. What do you mean? And so I do think, again, some of it is context specific. I want to know from guys first, how many times are you preaching every week? I've got friends that, man, they're still doing Sunday morning and Sunday evening and Wednesday night. And so it's, how many times are you preaching a week? Do you take on other speaking engagements, outside of Sunday mornings? How large is your staff? Are you a pastor in an established church, or are you a solo church planner? And then you're just taking into account, I think, different people prepare at different paces. And so the first thing I say is, most importantly, just finding, what works for you and what works for your church context. But, for me, it's interesting. You mentioned your prep process. I'm almost the opposite. I do typically take about 10 to 12 hours a week with a manuscript. But if I don't manuscript a sermon, it actually takes me substantially longer.
Huh.
Public speaking is not something that actually comes naturally to me. Part of my testimony is like the idea of like being called to ministry just terrified me. I mean, just being in front of people, I mean, in a sense, still just causes me like a level of anxiety. I mean, of just like, oh my goodness. I am a much more naturally introverted person. I'm forcibly extroverted. So, my wife and I, we're kind of wired the same. I say, like, I can people, but it takes a lot out of me. I am all in on Sunday mornings. I am with people. I'm engaged. I'm in conversation. Monday morning, I'm wiped. That relationally, that takes a lot out of me. To preach without notes would take me 20 hours of prep every single week. Like that's just
Wow.
how I'm wired. I would need that much time to prepare it, to internalize it, to rehearse it, to be confident about doing it. And because if I wasn't confident, I would just spend the whole weekend just worried, sick, like, gosh, how's this going to go tomorrow?
Yeah.
And so that's part of how I'm wired. But it's
So with that then, because I think there's a lot of guys who go, man, if I could do it and do it well
yeah,
in 10 to 12 hours, I'd get a lot of my ministry and life back. Like,
sure, yeah,
so talk us through the stages, right? I compare preparing a sermon a lot to like cooking a meal, right? There's the gathering up the ingredients. There's the figuring out what am I going to make, which is kind of the framing and the structure and and then there's the seasoning it and cooking it. You're doing that whether you manuscript it or not, but talk
sure,
us through your sequence, and in particular the writing part, because I think everyone's going to go, okay, I'm going to study it myself, I'm going to read it a bunch of different times, I'm going to do word studies, I'm going to read commentaries, blah blah blah. But like in that, if let's just say it's 12 hours, at what hour are you starting the writing, and what do you have to do in order to hit that and then be able to get it done within that window?
A lot of it was just developed over time, but I have found a rhythm that's been helpful for me. And so I prefer to do mine in stages throughout the course of the week. And so basically, what I do is, and what the caveat I want to give here too is that I enjoy writing and it comes naturally to me. But I can typically prep about a 4,500 word manuscript in 6 to 8 hours. And I can do total prep in about 10 to 12 hours. And so, just kind of working through my process. Mondays, it's just my reading of the text. I want to be really familiar with the text that I'm preaching. Basic exegesis. I'm trying to identify, what we call the key truth, what, a lot of guys would call the big idea. Hey, what's the key truth of this passage that I want to focus on? Try to develop that day at least an exegetical outline. But most days I'm able to go ahead and get a homiletical outline done as well. So I've basically got the skeleton in that 2-hour period. And then on Tuesday, I want to start putting a little bit more meat on the bones. That's when I'm doing a lot of cross-referencing. I like to let the Bible explain the Bible. And so that's where I'm going through what supplemental verses are we going to connect this to? Bullet note explanation. When I look at what I'm preaching this week about Jesus as a boy in the temple, I'm hitting things about, Jewish boys at age 13 being accountable to the law, and Joseph and Mary, what would have gone into the trip to Jerusalem, and bullet point explanation of like, hey, just make sure you cover this, cover this, cover this. And then also, as best as possible, I want to go ahead and identify, hey, this is going to be the illustration here. Here's how I'm going to apply this here. And I'll just do that basically in a page. And so So then Wednesday's my writing day. When I sit down Wednesday, that's what I'm starting with. And by then, I've spent a couple days, because I'm sure you're the same. I think most preachers are the same. You're thinking about your sermon even when you're not thinking about your sermon. I mean, it's always, Sunday comes every week, and so we don't really have the luxury to not be thinking about it. So it's just kind of marinating on that text throughout the course of the week. I'm formulating things in my head, but Wednesday's my writing day. I'm completely blocked off on Wednesdays. I block off the whole day. I don't take meetings typically on Wednesdays. I don't always need the whole day, but I block it off just in case I do need it. It's because every once in a while it is. I mean, I'll spend 4 hours and it's like, dang, I've got a page done. and so, and again, especially if it's a harder thing you're trying to work through and study, it can just take some time. I try to be finished with the rough draft of the manuscript in today, Wednesday. Thursday morning, what I'm doing, that's when I'm starting to do the walkthroughs. I'm gonna do a couple read throughs of it on Thursday morning, and that's where I'm really paying attention to. Hey, is this how
Like out loud?
Yeah, not out loud. I'll kind of read to myself
Okay.
silently. I can do that in a way that I know how I'm going to preach it. I know, what the inflections are going to be. And so no, it's typically just kind of a couple silent read throughs. I'm usually like whispering it to myself. My truck has really well tinted windows, fortunately. So I'll preach in my truck when I'm driving around. I'll just say things out loud. And then when I park, I'll make a quick note, a note in my notes app like that. That's how I want to say that. I'll come back to it later. So there's lots of things happening in between, all this. And then Thursday,
Dude, you're a menace on the road. I mean, you're either looking at mountains or you're looking at your sermon notes.
I am. Yeah.
I'm
Well,
scared.
I'm not looking at my notes, but just, I sometimes I just need to talk it out. Like I know what I'm trying to say, but I can't write it. But once I start talking,
Yep.
I'll just try it 5 or 6 times. I'm like, there it is, and
Yeah,
then
that's great.
I'll hang on to it. And so yeah, Thursdays, that's what I'm doing, just that. Then I pretty much stop noon on Thursdays. I'm like, all right, feel good about this. Typically our team needs stuff from me by Wednesdays at noon. That we do a worship guide every week. That's for community group discussion guides.
Mhm.
That's so that's there is a certain amount of information they've got to have by noon on Wednesdays. And so, but then, I try to really leave it from Thursday till about Saturday night at 8 o'clock. I go to bed early, but right before I go to bed, I'll just read it once. I want that, to be the last thing on my mind before I go to sleep. And then I'm an early riser Sunday mornings. I'll get up and I'll do a couple read throughs then. But after that, that's it. It's like, hey, the old saying, the hay is in the barn at this point. It's,
Sure.
I've read, I've studied, I've prayed, I've prepared, I've walked through. It's time now to preach in the power of the Holy Spirit and trust that the Lord is going to use this for His glory. So yeah, it's typically like 2 hours Monday, a couple more hours Tuesday, 6 to 8 hours on Wednesday, maybe another hour or two on Thursday. So most of the time for me, it's about a 10 to 11 hour process. Sometimes it'll go 12 to 15, just depending on what I'm preaching in a given week.
Well, what you just described and what you said earlier, that idea of writing yourself clear or driving around your truck and talking yourself clear, I think that's what's so key. And I think that's probably, for me, one of the losses sometimes when guys are not manuscripting is it's just not that clear. It's like you had the kernel of a great idea and it didn't quite get there, and so I think whether you manuscript or not, that's one of the things that has to develop. Even just different personalities, like you're talking about, like, I don't like getting in front of people. Well, I did theater as a kid, so like,
yeah.
I don't care, like that's fine, and I could memorize my lines by saying it out loud a few times, so I can just have a couple conversations with staff about what my sermon's about, and it's pretty internalized. Where that's just not how everybody is, right? So a lot of this, like you're saying, it is figuring out what works for you, what fits with your personality and your approach. But there's some unchangeable things in there. Like, I want to preach the text. I want to get this in me so that I really believe this. But I don't want to rely on my belief of it. I want to rely on the power of God. And, whatever the journey is you take to get there, I think that's probably what's most important. So I love the intentionality, and I love that you're doing it early in the process. I think that also helps internalize it. That idea of blocking off a day, I talk to guys sometimes in the preaching lab and they'll say, well, my sermon prep time always gets interrupted. I said, well, what do you mean it gets interrupted? They'll say, well, I mean to do it on this day, but then people will ask for a meeting or whatever. And I say, well, why do you accept the meeting? Like, this is where you literally put it on your calendar and you say, I'm sorry, I'm unavailable. I have a commitment. No one ever comes back and is like, well, what's your commitment? But you do. You have a meeting. It's with yourself.
Yeah.
With your,
We have a biblical precedent for that. Guys who preach need to be encouraged and empowered in this. You go to Mark 1, early in the morning while it was still dark, he goes to a desolate place and he prays. And disciples come to him and, they're like, hey, everyone is looking for you.
Yeah.
And his response to that is, I've got to go to the next town.
Sure.
I can send to preach the gospel. You look at what was the growth of the early church, the explosive growth of the early church, as busy as it was. We get to Acts chapter 6. There's a very serious care need that needs to be met. And yet, what's the response of the apostles? We will devote ourselves to prayer and to the ministry of the word. And so that is an exhortation, in some cases, an admonition that some guys need is like, hey, whether you're a church planter or you're a seasoned veteran pastor, your primary shepherding responsibility is the preaching of the word. And I wouldn't encourage guys to become a recluse. Like I would not encourage you to be the guy who's in study 40 hours a week and never interacting with people, because there are other leadership and shepherding responsibilities as well. We have a biblical mandate: study to show yourself approved. So to not study is to not be approved. A lot of that is like it's building a culture where that's baked into the culture, that's understood, that boundary is respected, it's defended for you, and it's discipling your congregation to understand that time is necessary. That if there really is going to be a well-developed sermon for the whole congregation on a weekly basis, the reality is that just takes time. And no congregation, no church member should want their pastor, microwaving a sermon on a Sunday morning. No one should want that. And so that's an encouragement I would give to leaders and to churches is make sure that time is guarded, preserved, protected. That's something I am so grateful for in our church. I mean, it's something that our staff respects and preserves for me. It's something that our elder team respects and preserves for me. Something our congregation understands. And we're all better for it. And so I would really encourage guys, you have a biblical precedence to be faithfully in study, preparing for the sermon that you're going to deliver to your congregation.
Well, someone's going to pay the price. Either you're going to pay it
absolutely
in preparation, or they're going to pay it as they have to listen to your rambly bad sermon. So, man, this has been super helpful. And Taylor, I appreciate your heart in this. I mean, so much of that has come through. And just the resonance that I've sensed in relating and interacting with you online has, been confirmed by this conversation. So thank you for that. I want to give you the last word. Is there any last exhortation or encouragement you have for guys as they think through specifically the idea of manuscripting?
I would encourage guys that regardless of whether you manuscript or you don't manuscript, do what God has gifted you to the best of your ability for his glory. And I would encourage, again, if you're a manuscript preacher, you're not a manuscript preacher, don't demonize the other side. Don't straw man the other side. The Lord uses all kinds of preaching. I've heard some really, really good manuscripted sermons, and I've heard some really, really bad sermons without notes. I've heard some really, really good sermons without notes. I've heard some really, really bad manuscripted sermons. Yeah. If I'm listening to a podcast and I'm not asking, is this sermon being delivered with a manuscript or without a manuscript? I'm asking, is this sermon good? At the end of the day, good preaching is good preaching and bad preaching is bad preaching. And so whatever your gifting is, whatever your calling is, always be striving to get better at it. So Luke, that's why I really appreciate what you guys are doing here. Just helping others grow in their gifts, cultivate the gifts that the Lord's given to them. It's something that we should all be doing for as long as we're in ministry. And so I would just encourage you, good writer, bad writer, just be who God has uniquely called you to be. And let's really learn to champion and appreciate each other's gifts when it comes to the task of preaching on a weekly basis.
Amen, dude. That's a great word. So yeah, Taylor, thank you so much for being with us here today. This has been really great. And everybody listening, thank you for tuning in. Thanks for the work that you're doing to try to be faithful, to try to serve the Lord where you're at. Lots of good stuff to glean here. So great to be with you guys today. And I think that's it. So Taylor, blessings to you. Thanks for being with us.
Luke, thanks, man. Take care.
All right, everybody. Thanks for joining. We'll see you next time.